This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
There are two chapters dealing with economics. The first one, deals with what's known as macroeconomics. And the word macro means large. So this is the branch of economics which deals with basically national and international effects. And this is really the sort of area where governments tend to be very interested and will intervene. So macroeconomics will be addressing topics such as how can we measure the size of a country's economy? How do we know if it's growing or shrinking and so on? What is the method of measuring it? If it's stagnating, if it's not growing, then how can we stimulate the economy to make it grow? What about unemployment? What is the unemployment rate? What affects it? If we've got 10% of people out of work, how can we get that down to maybe only 6% of people out of work? What sort of macroeconomic levers does government have to affect unemployment? Inflation, how can that be controlled? We know that there's usually some sort of inflation in every economy. Usually when it's down at 1 or 2%, nobody worries. But if it goes up into like 20, 50, 100% per year, one of the effects, of course, is that people continually need pay rises to keep up with it. Their savings diminish in value and so on. It's really not a good situation. Also, although we don't have to, but in this syllabus, macroeconomics will look at exchange rates, foreign currency exchange rates, and what influences that, and maybe how our imports and exports compare. Is there a gap, if you like, between those? As I said, government is likely to get particularly involved in macroeconomics, and the areas that government gets involved in, there's a huge number of influences, and here we're just looking at a kind of summary of it here. So down the left you have the government, and down the right of this you have the effect on the organizations. So the government's overall economic policy will influence market demand. So we'll see later that if the government were to reduce interest rates, it means that more people are willing to borrow, and usually once you borrow you spend, and therefore this stimulates the demand in the economy. The cost of finance is connected with interest rates as well, but if interest rates are low, then it means it's relatively cheap for businesses to raise loan capital and to invest in new machinery, new factories, expansion of the business. Taxation, of course, governments need taxation to help them with government spending, but you could well argue that if taxation was around 95%, why would anyone kind of bother working? If it's only going to be certainly a disincentive to working much overtime. If taxation was way down at 5%, there's lots of incentive to work, you keep nearly all of it, but of course it may not raise enough cash for government purposes. So deciding on the taxation rates, and of course we know that a low taxation rate in a country can encourage foreign companies to come in and set up there, benefit from a low taxation regime. Industry policy, protection versus free trade. So protection is where the government, for example, puts tariffs on imports. There's a lot of talk about this at the moment, but if, let's say, it was on cars, and the government says, right, I will put 100% tax on all cars being imported, then essentially they are protecting the home car industry. Free trade is the reverse. Free trade would say you can import, export to your heart's content, and the government will not in any way seek to control that. The government can try to encourage certain areas. It can give grants. It can give grants, for example, maybe to set up high-tech industries. It can give grants to get companies to set up in areas of the country which have got high unemployment. Regulation. How easy is it, for example, to set up a business? And in the UK, it's pretty easy to set up a business. You just register a company with Companies House, and you're really ready to go. Entry barriers, capacity. Sometimes the government will limit the number of businesses of a particular sort which it wants to be set up. So the government could, if it wanted to, say we have enough television channels at the moment, and we're not going to allow another television channel for whatever reason until maybe one of these ones goes out of business. The infrastructure, the road, the rail, the ports, the airports are going to influence the economy because transport, distribution, getting hold of raw materials, distributing your finished products and so on is made harder or difficult according to the infrastructure. Social policy. If the government says once you hire somebody, you can never ever make them redundant, and you can never ever dismiss them no matter how useless they are, in that very extreme situation, companies are going to be very reluctant indeed to go out and hire more people, because if they make an error and get the wrong person, or if the business has a bit of a downturn and they're left having to pay high wage bill, then people are going to be very reluctant to employ people. If, however, and I'm not saying there should be no employment protection, but if there's what you might call a more reasonable form of employment protection, so that economic necessity could be maybe put up as a reason to make people redundant, then the chances are that employment rates in general are going to be lower. People will employ people knowing that in an emergency they can actually get rid of them. Also, social policy will look at the training which is provided by government, the schools, the technical colleges, the university, maybe subsidies given to train your staff. And then there is foreign policy. The government can get involved in trade delegations to try to encourage exports. The government can provide export guarantees, export credits, so that if the foreign customer doesn't pay, the government insurance scheme will make sure you haven't lost everything. So there's a myriad of ways in which the government can influence the economy and businesses. Now, how is income measured? And national income is defined as the total value of a country's final output for all new goods and services. It's important that we remember it is final output, because if a company buys raw materials, that is a purchase, incorporates that into a product, sells it to a member of the public, that's another purchase, if you like, but really you're double counting the raw material element. So it is the final output of all new goods and services. So it's household spending. This is on think of it, food, groceries, cars, televisions, anything that we spend money on. You can also be spending money on rent. Plus capital investment spending. Now, notice capital investment spending, this is companies, okay? Because when a company buys a machine, really that machine, as a non-current asset, that's not going to be sold on to a member of the public. When a company buys raw materials, that is going to be sent on, and we have this double counting problem. But if a company goes and buys a machine, then of course that is a final output, is a final purchase. There's government spending on wages, for example, for teachers, for the armed services, for putting up new buildings, for building roads. That comes into national income. Export is money coming in from abroad. But import, note that imports of goods and services, this is essentially money leaking out of the economy as it goes to foreign suppliers. And this gives us the gross domestic product. And the gross national product is the gross domestic product plus profit income from abroad. So if a company had a foreign subsidiary and has paid dividends, that becomes part of the gross national product. The circular flow of income is a concept which is very, very close to measuring the income of a business, really. It recognizes that the economies work by really the flow of money round and round. So a firm produces goods, and we spend money on those goods. Us spending money on those goods allows the company to pay wages to its workers, and in exchange they provide labour. So there's all this kind of toing and froing, if you like, this circular flow of income, as it's called. If the circular flow of income increases, then, of course, the total income of the country is going to increase, because more goods are being sold, more wages are being earned, more is being spent by households on goods and so on. And the larger the circular flow of income, then the larger the national income is going to be. How can we make it larger? Well, government spending. So one way government can spend is simply to print money. It's not an advisable method of spending, but simply printing money, distribute that to people, send it out to people, give them $1,000 each, say, spend it. Then, of course, the consumer spending is going to go up. The amount of goods bought is going to go up. Consumer spending goes up. Companies need to produce more. They need to pay more in terms of wages, in the income. Stimulate exports and investment. So an injection into this here is basically to spend money on building a new factory. You spend money in building a new factory. This is going to produce more goods. You pay people more income. It's providing more work for people. And this will increase the circular flow of income and will increase national income. Leakages or withdrawals from the system. Taxation can simply suck money out. Savings. Savings, economists often don't know what to make of savings. Savings are set up as being a worthwhile endeavour. It's money for a rainy day. But of course, if you put money in the bank, it is not being spent. It is not going to a firm. The firm doesn't have to produce those goods. And if a firm doesn't have to produce the goods, it means it maybe doesn't have to employ all of those people. So the higher savings, there's a potential actually reducing the income of the country. If we're all spendthrifts, and particularly if we go out and borrow and spend it, then the national income of the country will increase, although it may put us in a personally perilous situation. And then another leakage is imports. Instead of spending money in our country on goods and services, giving employment to people in our country, the money just leaks out abroad. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is total demand in the economy for goods. Think of it as a kind of a measure of national income. Aggregate supply is the total supply of goods and services in the economy. So these should match. So here we have an equilibrium point here, where the price of the goods has fallen sort of aggregate demand here. As their output goes up, the aggregate demand is growing along this axis here. So as the price of goods falls, people will buy more goods, and as the price of goods rises, factories and producers will be motivated to produce more goods. And at some point you have an equilibrium in the economy where the goods produced precisely match the goods which are demanded at a certain price. If for some reason aggregate demand increases, in other words goes from here to here, and we'll see how we could maybe stimulate aggregate demand in a moment, then the aggregate supply will gradually increase as well to match it. Aggregate demand increasing tends to put prices up. There are people, if you like, competing over the purchase of goods. It will put the market price up. This in turn will encourage new suppliers to enter the market, and we end up at point B, where supply and demand are matched again, but at slightly higher prices. Now this will continue. This can continue until, say, we got to here. So we keep increasing the aggregate demand. It'll come out to kind of here. And then when we try and supply more goods, we find that we can't, because everyone's working as much overtime as they possibly can. We can't lay our hands on any more material, that's all used up, and so on here. But particularly when full employment is reached, no more goods can be made. So we have increasing demand, but a fixed number of goods. There's much competition for these goods, and the way the match is kind of made is that the price rises. The price of the goods will rise up until essentially again demand and supply will match, but they will match at a much higher price. And this basically causes inflation. If there are too many people chasing too many goods, the price of those goods will go up, and that is a cause of inflation. A rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, this is what we're looking at now. We're not talking here about moving up and down the curve. We're not talking about going like that. We're talking about a rightward shift. In other words, we're moving like that, from demand 1 to demand 2. That's a rightward shift. And it means that at any particular price of the goods, there's more demand. So we've stimulated demand, if you like, for goods, even though we haven't dropped the price of those goods. Ways in which that could happen: an increase in disposable income, maybe by reducing tax. Another way in which you can increase disposable income is by reducing interest rates. So in many economies, many people's disposable income goes on paying for their mortgage. If mortgage interest rates fall down, then people have more spending money, they will go and spend it, and so the aggregate demand increases. And there will be a danger in very low interest rates economies that inflation may creep in. Consumers deciding to save less. So they take this money out of the bank and they simply spend it on goods. Even though the price of goods is not decreased, people are simply psychologically willing to spend money. Increased government spending. The government steps in and, for example, starts buying. So you could think of a health service. Health service got patients in hospital, has to feed them, and the policy is to feed them much better, much more food. So that government spending on the health service is, of course, buying food from producers and supermarkets that otherwise wouldn't have been bought. A more relaxed monetary policy, like interest rates going down, like making it easy for people to borrow money, and a change in net exports. A change in net exports will stimulate a rightward shift in the demand curves. It can go the other way, of course, a leftward shift on the demand curve. If you decrease disposable income, if the government, instead of taxing at 30%, maybe taxed at 70%, and the government borrowed less, the government will be maybe spending the same, but we've got less money in our pockets to spend. That would put a dampener on the economy. If interest rates go up, this tends again to put pressure downwards on the economy. If you have to pay much more on your monthly mortgage, you've got much less to spend on food and clothing and travel. Higher interest rates dampen consumer spending down and are used actually as an antidote to inflation. Now, inflation is the price of goods going up for no particular reason, and the causes are, as we've talked about, demand pull, where the aggregate demand is higher than the aggregate supply. More goods are demanded than can be supplied, and that competition to buy goods pushes up the price of the goods. There is cost push. So the cost of goods increases. For example, people are paid more. So our government has increased the minimum wage which people must be paid. Increasing the minimum wage obviously pushes up the wage bill of employers, and they will inevitably pass on that increase in cost in an increase in price. That is cost push. It can, of course, be seasonal. If you are buying petrol, buying wheat, buying many foodstuffs, cost can go up because of weather effects, and that will feed into, or potentially feed into, inflation. Import cost inflation. The foreign country puts, for some reason there is extra cost on imports. It could be that the exchange rate has changed so that importing stuff from America is now more expensive. It could be that the consumer demand in the foreign country increases, and this pushes up the price of goods there, and any which are exported to us are similarly going to be inflated in price. Expectation. Expectation is where you're bargaining for your pay rise, and you say, well, I think next year inflation is going to be 10%, therefore I'd better ask for 12%. And of course, if that 12% is then incorporated into a wage bill, it will cause inflation next year. And finally, an increase in the money supply. For example, the decrease in interest rates, making it easier for people to borrow, the government printing more money, as it's called, all increases the amount of money which people have available to spend, and that can cause inflation. Unemployment, the types of unemployment, you just need to know kind of what they are. Real wage unemployment is where wages have increased to a point where employers will not employ anybody else at that price. So the wages are so high that it acts as a dampener on employment, and it may even encourage employers to try to get rid of some of the high salaried individuals. Frictional unemployment is temporary. Frictional unemployment is the unemployment identified with people between jobs. So it's temporary. So you might leave your job now and you might have 2 weeks unemployment before you start your new job. So it's not a big problem normally. It's pretty inevitable if people are moving jobs. You're going to have a bit of frictional unemployment. Seasonal means what it says. We have seasonal unemployment, let's say in the UK, in the building industry and in the agricultural industry. In winter, because of rain and weather, it can be relatively hard to put up new buildings. Obviously, the harvest is over with. There's no fruit picking and so on in winter. The holiday business is also a seasonal business and gives rise to seasonal unemployment. Structural unemployment is a much more serious one, and it is long-term and probably irreversible. For example, in the UK, probably 40 years ago, we had a very large coal mining industry, and now we don't have one at all. And the reason we don't have one at all, there are various reasons, but all our mines were deep mines and relatively expensive to get coal up, and it was much cheaper to import coal, which was really found on the surface in certain countries. There was also the beginning of the feeling that coal was a particularly polluting form of fuel, and so was a move away from coal to gas. This is a structural unemployment in the coal mining industry. Those jobs will never come back as far as we know. It's very tough on the people who lose their jobs and so on. Governments do try to come in and encourage other businesses to replace it and so on. But if you were, a 50-year-old miner and lose your job, then retraining to other skills and the social dislocation that can be caused by any sort of structural unemployment can be severe. Technological unemployment, I always think, is almost a subset of structural unemployment. Technological unemployment comes through advances in technology, quite obviously. So think what would happen if computer-controlled vehicles, where they can drive without a driver, become safe and accepted. Think what that is going to do to all the thousands of people who drive lorries and drive vans, and even taxi drivers. So the technology of GPS, automatic vehicle driving, and the like, will potentially give rise to considerable unemployment, but I think it's another form of structural unemployment. Cyclical unemployment really relates to cycles in industry or cycles in the economy. Most economies go through a kind of very long cycle, something like 10 years. If you think, it's not dead regular, but if you think, how long is it between crashes on the stock exchange and economic crises and so on, you know that things can go very well and then they can go very badly, and the whole world economy almost goes through some sort of longish cycle. And of course, at the bottom of this cycle here, where things are in the doldrums, then there's going to be much more unemployment. How can the government try to control the economy? What levers does it have to pull and push there? And the first set of levers is known as fiscal policy. And here the government looks at government expenditure, government income, and government borrowing. If the government is going to spend money, it has to raise the money either from tax or from borrowing. What the government can do, if it wanted to stimulate the economy, is to borrow much more and spend it. And during the last recession, the banking crisis 2008, some economists said that because everyone's frightened now of spending money, banks won't lend money and so on, what governments should do is they should go out and borrow money, and governments should spend money to stimulate employment and then stimulate wages and salaries, and then the government's income through tax will gradually increase. Other economists said that was wrong, that what happens if the government borrows a lot, the government has to pay a lot of interest. And really what we should do is to cut the expenditure down. And if we cut the expenditure down, we should try and, of course, cut the deficit, cut the borrowing down, and like. But, of course, what also happened was that many people's income fell and taxation takings fell as well. But fisc here in fiscal policy really meant the king's purse in Old English, I think. So the government has to keep these in balance, really. So the government, if it wants to spend more, either has to tax more, but of course that is taking money out of the economy. You can't spend that money directly, and that may have its downsides as well. The other method is monetary policy, which is looking at how the government can manage the supply of money. And it can do it by interest rates, or at least the central bank does it by interest rates. The lower the interest rates, the easier it is to borrow, the more money people will borrow. That's going to increase the supply of money. It's going to stimulate the economy. There is the money supply. The government can increase or decrease the money supply itself. It's not called printing money anymore. It's called quantitative easing. But it makes much more money available to banks and so on, which they can then lend on. Reserve requirements and credit controls. This is saying how much money banks can lend on. So if I deposit money in the bank of 1,000, the government might say that you have to keep, for safety, you keep 10% of that in the bank. So you can go and you can repay people if they want their money back, and you lend on to people 900. So people now have got borrowed 900, that's going to be spent, etc., etc., and ultimately it's going to find its way back to the bank, and you put 90 in there, and this will allow 810 to be lent on again. So money is not just lent once. Money is lent, is spent, goes into the bank, is lent again, is spent, goes into the bank, and round and round. So this is you can see is going to add up to quite a lot of money, which banks can lend on. If, however, instead of keeping the reserve requirement at 10%, you kept it at 50%, then the pattern's going to be rather different. Of 1,000 put in the bank to start with, 500 goes there, but the bank can only lend on to businesses and people 500. That's going to find its way back into the bank as people earn the money it's spent on in companies. They put the money in the bank, and this very quickly goes down. It diminishes very, very quickly, and I think you can see at the end of the day the amount of money which has been created here is going to be much less than the amount of money which is created through the banking system if the reserve requirement is much lower, is only 10%. And finally, the government might try to change or manipulate exchange rates. This is actually notoriously difficult because the markets are of such power, international money markets are of such power that banks, the governments are rarely masters of the exchange rate. They might try to have an official one, but very quickly all sorts of black markets grow up. International payments occur for a number of reasons. It could be simple importing or exporting, where you either have to pay or you will receive money from overseas customers. It could be that you've invested abroad and maybe your subsidiary is paying you dividends, and that may come in euro, you want to convert it to your own currency. It could be that you're investing abroad, that you decide to buy an overseas company and bring it into your group, and then you will need to take some of your home currency and translate it, change it into the foreign currency, because that's what the sellers of the foreign shares will be looking for. In all of these events, the exchange rate is going to be critical, and you'll be well aware of the importance of an exchange rate, either from going on holidays or from studying overseas, that a change in the exchange rate will make you feel relatively poorer or relatively wealthier. It depends basically what you get for your money. Now, what determines the exchange rates? And ultimately, it depends on the relative attractiveness of the currency. If a lot of people want your currency, there'll be a lot of competition for it. That will drive up its price. If your currency is not thought to be desirable, perhaps not thought to be safe, then people will be perhaps selling the currency to move into what they think is a safer currency, and the predominant sale of a currency, putting lots and lots on the market, will drive the price down. And really the price of a currency is its exchange rate. Influences on this exchange rate, effectively influences on the relative attractiveness of currencies, depend on economic outlook. If the economic outlook of a country is good, this implies that the currency, their economy is strong, that their currency is perhaps a safe one in which to invest. Interest rates. If in America they put up the interest rate, let's say from 2% to 5%, then people with spare cash see that by converting it into dollars, investing those dollars, they'll be able to earn 5% there, where perhaps in their own currency they may only have been able to earn 1, 2, 3%. So changing interest rates makes the currency relatively attractive or unattractive. Imports and exports. If I keep importing a lot of goods into my country, that means I have to keep changing my currency. Let's say I'm importing from the USA. I import lots of goods from US suppliers. The US suppliers will expect to be paid in dollars. So I'll have to take my currency and change that into dollars so that I can pay my suppliers. This makes demand for dollars high. And if you have what's called a trade imbalance, if there are many more imports than exports, then to finance those imports, you're going to have to sell more and more of your own currency, buy more and more of the seller's currency. That will put a downward pressure on your currency and an upward pressure on the other currency. That will be known as a trade deficit. Inflation as well can affect the exchange rates. If in, say, America, the inflation rate were 10%, that means that every year a dollar in America is going to buy about 10% less. It is in a way depreciating quickly. If you compare that to, say, the euro, let's say in euro countries, the inflation rate was only about 2%. Then in Euroland, the euro is depreciating only at 2%. So that makes the euro relatively attractive, depreciating at only 2% because of low inflation there, and the dollar relatively unattractive because inflation in dollar land is at 10%. It's wearing out, it's depreciating much more quickly. As it says in the slide here, if imports are much, much greater than exports, let's say the USA exports much, much more to Europe than it imports, then European dollars will be predominantly, European euros, I beg your pardon, will be predominantly sold to buy US dollars. The imports to Europe are much higher. They have to find lots of dollars. To find lots of dollars, they have to sell lots of euros, and the exchange rate is going to move. And it might fall, as it suggests here, from $1 being worth 95 euros to $1 being worth only worth 98 euros. That is a rise in the value of the dollar, because $1 now gets you 98 or 0.98 euros instead of 0.95 euros. It is a fall in the value of the euro, because now to buy $1, it's going to take 0.98 euros instead of 0.95 euros. Does this matter? Well, it will make imports more expensive. If I'm importing into Europe, if now I have to spend, let's say, 10 euros buying an item worth $1, if I have to spend 10 euros to buy an item exported from America, instead of only paying 8 euros to buy that item, then that import has become essentially more expensive. In the European market, it's costing 10 euros instead of 8 euros. And that causes inflation. And that will tend to decrease the popularity of imports. Relatively, they have become more expensive. And it will tend to drive up domestic inflation, because these goods that you're buying from abroad, they're not always goods which are easy to do without or replace. It might be essential food imports. These essential food imports are now more expensive, and this will drive domestic inflation. On the other hand, exports from Europe to America will become cheaper, they become more competitive. And there is, of course, a kind of self-correction here. If you've been importing too much and the effective price of imports goes up, then that is going to put a bit of a brake on the imports. It may mean that the domestically produced goods are more competitive than they previously were. However, the real problem comes if there is a sustained imbalance in currency movements. What happens if day after day, week after week, year after year, for example, the UK imports far more goods from America than it exports? This means that year after year, the UK has to take pounds and change them into dollars. And people will begin to wonder, where are all these pound sterlings coming from? Is it just the Bank of England or the government printing lots and lots more money, and that the paper that we believe has a worth is effectively becoming perhaps slightly risky? And if you begin to think that a currency is unsafe, then of course the exchange rate is going to move drastically. You're going to demand an awful lot of an unsafe currency to make it worth the risk. In addition to the exchange rate itself perhaps being influenced by imports and exports, governments can also cut down on their imports from a country. In other words, cut down on the amount of money they have to change into foreign currency in the following ways. They can put on import quotas. In other words, you say you are not allowed to import more than 10,000 cars. And the other demand for cars will have to be made up domestically. You can put up a tariff. A tariff is an extra tax on the imported goods, making them relatively more expensive, therefore relatively less competitive and less popular. And there can be procedural barriers. You make it very difficult for the imported goods to come in. Perhaps you say it has to go through a very, very stringent kind of inspection process or health and safety process, or you have to fill in millions of forms to allow the imports to come in, to make it difficult to slow down the import of goods and therefore to turn the consumer's attention perhaps away from the difficult to get imported goods to the easier to buy domestic goods. Economic growth means that there has been a rise in national income, a rise in the gross domestic product. What can bring this about? Well, it can be an increase in what's called physical capital. Think of that as machinery. really the greatest period of economic growth that occurred was essentially in England, at any rate, during the 19th century, when automation in, say, factories producing cloth and the invention of steam engines and so on, which allowed a power source to drive machinery. When you look at a graph of gross domestic product, as near as we can estimate it, it goes along very, very level for centuries, and it suddenly takes off during the Industrial Revolution. And essentially it was automation which made more goods, allowed more people to buy those goods more cheaply, created employment and so on. It was a real period of huge economic growth, coming from really the increase in physical capital. It can come from human capital. You train people to do something, give them a craft, give them a skill, and once they have that skill, they can sell that skill, they can be employed, and people want to buy that skill. And again, you have this increase in gross domestic product, which is basically the total income of the country. It can be technological breakthroughs. To some extent, what we're talking about in physical capital touched on that. Automation is a form of course, technological breakthrough. But once you, for example, invent microelectronics, then we have personal computers, we have much better televisions, we have much better cars, and so on. Once we invent a new pharmaceutical, then, which is successful, then of course you need a factory to produce that pharmaceutical. The internet itself, think of many jobs which are now dependent on online companies. People have invented new businesses which are only possible because of the infrastructure which is provided by the internet. And then there are natural resources. You suddenly discover, for example, that you have a valuable source of minerals in your country. Then of course that is going to stimulate people to mine the ore, to refine the ore. Perhaps it will stimulate the production of products which are made from those products. Now everyone tends to like, certainly governments tend to like economic growth, and there are some very strong positives to that. It does of course reduce poverty, particularly if the economic growth it can be measured as an increase in gross domestic product per person there, then every person could potentially feel richer. Reduced poverty means better nutrition. It means better housing. It means better clothing, and so on. It means better medical facilities can be afforded, either privately or, of course, if you have increased wages and salaries, the government can tax those or can get extra tax from the extra wages. The government could decide to build infrastructure, to set up better education, to set up better medical facilities. So there are many advantages coming from economic growth, and as I said, by and large governments are very keen on that as a strong positive on their government record. You can look and find negatives. For example, very strong economic growth tends to mean people have got more money that they want to spend, and if they're willing to spend more money, then that can push up inflation. There's more money chasing perhaps the same number of goods because perhaps the production of those goods has not kept up with the demand for those goods. It can cause pollution, of course, pollution coming from more factories, because perhaps people can afford a car, can afford to go on more journeys, afford to go on more trips by air, then it is likely that pollution and environmental damage will increase. And finally, it's likely to lead to a foreign exchange deficit, a current account deficit. If you are richer, you want to spend more money, then of course what you might want to spend it on are goods that are coming from abroad. You find that the computer produced abroad is an attractive thing and you want to buy it, and this will suck in foreign produced goods, and that can have of course an adverse effect on the exchange rate of your home currency. But by and large, I think the balance for most people is they prefer to see economic growth rather than economic decline, which can produce very difficult situations like unemployment. Functions of taxation. We know that taxation is the way the government raises money. But as well as raising money, there are certain other functions of tax, like you put a tax on cigarettes, and this is to diminish the consumption of something which is regarded as being unhealthy. You can put tax on flights, on aircraft, and on aircraft journeys and so on, because aircraft do cause noise, aircraft do cause pollution, and unless you tax that, there's no other easy way in which the airlines bear more of the cost of the side effects which they're causing in the economy. It can be redistributive. Generally speaking, people who are on very high incomes are taxed at a higher rate than people on very low incomes. And part of the reason is you take a lot of money from the people on the high incomes, and maybe through social security benefits or the provision of maybe free healthcare and so on, you effectively redistribute some of the money. Protect industries from foreign competition. Tariffs are a form of taxation. So we talked about cars coming into the country. You slap on 100% purchase tax on those, then this is going to protect your own home industry from imports. And to provide a stabilizing effect on national income. If you think the national income is getting overheated and inflation is a risk, then you can increase tax a little bit, take some of that disposable income away from people, and this will put a dampener on the economy and tend to reduce the amount of inflation. Types of taxation. A regressive tax takes a higher proportion of a poor person's salary than a rich person. So VAT is a regressive tax. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. In the UK, VAT is a 20% tax on many forms of consumption. So if I go out and buy, let's say, a mobile phone for $300, there's going to be tax on that at 20%, that's $60. Of course, $60 out of a poor person's salary is a much greater proportion than out of a rich person's. A proportional tax takes the same proportion of income from all levels, so simply setting your income tax level at 20% for everyone is a proportional tax. And then we have a progressive tax, like the more common type of income tax. Tax very low paid people at zero, then you come in and you begin maybe paying 20% tax, and then at some band higher on you begin paying 40% on that. And finally in this chapter, just remember the difference between a direct tax and an indirect tax. A direct tax is like income tax or corporation tax. It is basically a burden on the income of this person that is paid over to the Inland Revenue. I know that in income tax your employer kind of takes it off and pays it to the Inland Revenue, but that's an administrative business, really. It's your income, it's your tax. That is taxing you directly. An indirect tax is like VAT. It is collected by the revenue authority from an intermediary. So what happens is that if you go out and buy something, say clothing from a shop, the shop puts on 20%, and then that 20% has to be handed over to Inland Revenue. The shop is acting as a tax collector, that is an indirect tax. It can be a specific tax as a fixed sum per unit sold. So in the UK, say on a bottle of wine, there's a fixed tax. There's a fixed tax on a packet of cigarettes. There's a fixed tax on a bottle of whiskey, and so on. It's nothing to do with how valuable the item is. It's a fixed sum per litre or per 20 cigarettes, whatever it is. An ad valorem tax is a proportion of the value, a fixed percentage of the price of the good, of which VAT is an example of an ad valorem tax, which is proportional to the value of the item.